He knocked me over. I landed on the dog bowl.
This one's wife. He lost his job fighting women over this one's wife. Hello, I'm HG Tudor. Meet Inspector Tola Munro. That is the man that you can see in the thumbnail. There he is, wearing his uniform as he used to be a police officer. Now, when you read the thumbnail and think, he was fighting with two women over this one's wife? What was it? Some kind of custody battle? Was it enraged lovers that suddenly wanted a piece of her and couldn't decide who was going to walk into the sunset with her? No. As the Telegraph reports, a senior police officer who hit two women after an argument about this one's wife and race on the day of the King's coronation while off duty has been sacked. Inspector Tola Munro from South Bristol dragged one woman to the ground and punched her before hitting another in the face on May the 6th last year, a misconduct tribunal was told. The former president of the National Black Police Association completely lost control of himself when a discussion about the Duchess of Sussex and race became heated and personal, the BBC reported. Mr. Munro denied the allegations, insisting that he was provoked and had acted in self-defence. But barrister Mark Leigh Morgan, representing Avon and Somerset Police, accused him of telling an absolute pack of lies. The senior officer has now been sacked from the force after he was found guilty of gross misconduct. Jane Jones, the tribunal chairman, labelled the incident a terrible irony because Mr. Munro had previously helped tackle violence against women and girls. Just goes to show what standing up for this one's wife does to you then, doesn't it? The tribunal heard that Mr. Munro should have risen above provocation when one woman, witness A, became confrontational during a heated discussion about race. Witness A called 999 at around 1 p.m. that day, but apparently changed her mind mid-call. Police traced her number and sent officers to the location where the inspector had punched them, the tribunal heard. Witness B, the second woman, told police that Mr. Munro had hit her in the side of her face as she tried to step in. Mr. Leigh Morgan said Mr. Munro insisted he was defending himself after he was arrested on suspicion of 2 counts of common assault. The case was referred to the Crown Prosecution Service, which deemed there was insufficient evidence for there to be a realistic prospect of a successful prosecution. Giving evidence, Mr. Munro said he grabbed witness A by the shoulders and guided her down to the floor as she tripped after shouting and screaming at him. I didn't want her to hurt herself. She kicked out at me, which I blocked with my hands, and then I thought witness B was coming over to strike me, so I put my hand up to block her, he claimed. I believed at the time I was defending myself in response to being kicked at and witness B intervening, who I thought was going to strike me. I didn't punch witness A in the face, I didn't punch witness B. Superintendent Mark Edgington, head of the Professional Standards Department, said, "Ultimately, there is no place in policing for an officer who is found to have assaulted any member of the public. Whether on or off duty, officers and staff must adhere to the standards expected of anyone serving in policing, and Inspector Munro failed to do this. As an organisation, we have carried out a huge amount of work in recent years around the topic of violence against women and girls. Inspector Munro's actions have undermined those efforts and will likely damage public confidence in policing. We hope the public can see from the actions we have taken that these allegations have been taken seriously from the moment we learned of them. The public's trust in policing is dependent on rooting out any officer, no matter their rank or experience, who should not be serving the public. We hope the robust action taken in this case highlights that commitment." Now, in case you were wondering how could it be that he wasn't prosecuted for assault criminally, yet lost his job, the reason for that is that the two decision-making bodies operate to different standards of proof. So for the criminal prosecution, it would have to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, and the Crown Prosecution Service obviously decided it wouldn't reach that threshold. In relation to a misconduct hearing, the evidence is determined on the balance of probabilities, i.e., is it more likely than not he engaged in the misconduct that he was accused of, and evidently his version of events wasn't believed and the version of events of the two witnesses was believed. And therefore he was found to have assaulted those two women in a row over race and this one's wife, and therefore the decision was for him to be dismissed from his position, which is a rather unfortunate ending of this man's career who'd risen to the rank of an inspector. Now, we're not told anything about the race of the other two women, and we're not told precisely what it was that they were arguing about in relation to this one's wife. The matter is reported in a number of newspapers, but none of them actually explain what they were arguing about, other than the subject matter was race and this one's wife. Given that it was taking place on the day of the King's coronation, presumably it was the case that criticism was made of the King, perhaps, and the ladies were responding, or alternatively, criticism was made of this one's wife, and Mr. Monroe decided that he would defend her. Evidently, it didn't result in a good outcome for any of the people involved because the two women were assaulted, and he ended up losing his job. Just goes to show that this one's wife can cause you problems even when she's thousands of miles away from you. And former Inspector Turler Monroe essentially finds himself markled as a consequence of arguing on behalf of this one's wife. I think it would be a fair assumption that he was defending her in some way or advocating on her behalf, which resulted in the other two people taking a contrary view. Tempers flared, passions were invoked, and it resulted in the heated discussion becoming physical. What is it that motivates so many people to behave in this way when it comes to this one's wife? Why do they get so worked up? As you know, you'll have come across people who have defended this one's wife, and you'll have also most likely come across individuals that have defended her in a way which is particularly vitriolic, both in terms of their level of support and the whataboutisms that they engage in relation to the royal family. Why is it that people behave this way? Well, one might wonder, might they be a narcissist themselves? And of course, that's always a possibility. I have no further evidence about Mr. Monroe's behaviour to make an assessment, but if he was a narcissist, then naturally the comments of the women in relation to this one's wife threatened his need for control, and he responded arguing and in a physical fashion in order to try and nullify those threats. But we don't know enough about him to assume that he's a narcissist, and therefore I just mention that because many people do ask me, is it the case, HG, that those that support this one's wife, the way that they go about it, are they a narcissist? Well, yes, some will be, but most won't. Most will actually be normals. And what tends to happen with those that support her, they don't really have any emotional empathy for the people that they're dealing with. So, for instance, when you have an interaction with a sugar in an online environment, they don't know you, and therefore they have no emotional empathy for you. And that's why they result to ad hominem attacks. That's why they result in the whataboutisms and being generally nasty to you and threatening you, because you are just a disembodied stranger on the internet. Thus, you're outside of their circle of emotional empathy, because normal people do have emotional empathy, but you're outside of that circle, so they behave in the unpleasant manner that they do towards you. Many individuals behave this way also because, in essence, this one's wife engenders their own innate prejudices. She is a vehicle for those people to articulate their prejudices, all under the auspices of some higher purpose of defending her. In some instances, certain individuals will have experienced prejudicial behaviour. let's not be naive and claim that it doesn't exist. It does. And therefore, certain individuals, having experienced that, believe what this one's wife says with regard to her own experiences and sees that they are kindred spirits. They feel a degree of validation from her and therefore align behind her. They're, of course, invariably mistaken, as much of her experience is a revision of history and is fabricated. In other instances, it's quite simply that it enables them to put forth their own agenda in relation to such issues as race, and essentially talking about her engenders their own prejudices. And in this instance, it's cost Mr. Monroe his job. He got so worked up arguing about this one's wife and race with two women who he didn't know, two strangers, that he ended up assaulting them. He denies it, but the police misconduct panel didn't believe him, suggesting that he had come out with an absolute pack of lies. And in the end, the other two witnesses were believed, he was not, and he ended up getting sacked. One wonders if Mr. Monroe considers it was worth it to argue in the defence of this one's wife to the extent that he lost his job, or perhaps he just sits there with the belief that he was right and they were wrong, and he's been mistreated. Might he have the same victim mentality of this one's wife? It's entirely possible. But it's an example of how, once again, having some involvement, even though it's from thousands of miles away, in relation to this one's wife, ends up causing a problem for an individual, so he ends up losing his job. Another one is Markle. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.